There is a certain quiet that comes with control. For 20 years I had cultivated it, nurtured it, built walls of routine and success around it. My world was a symphony of predictable, elegant notes, the warmth of the morning sun on the Italian marble of my veranda, the precise taste of the Earl Grey tea my housekeeper prepared, the satisfying weight of the Financial Times in my hands. Peace, I had learned, was not something you find, it was something you build, brick by expensive brick, over the ruins of a life that had been torn apart, and my peace was a fortress. That morning the symphony played as it always did. The roses in the garden below perfumed the air. Everything was in its place. Then, a new, unwelcome sound intruded. The gravelly crunch of tires on the long driveway. The U.S. mail truck. A daily, mundane event. But as it came to a stop, I felt a strange, cold flicker in the pit of my stomach, a discordant note. A man in the familiar blue uniform got out. He was not Tom, the cheerful old man who had delivered our mail for the last decade. This man was a stranger. Tall, gaunt, his face a roadmap of hardships I couldn't begin to imagine. He walked towards the grand staircase of the veranda, his steps heavy, methodical. He didn't look at me as he approached, his eyes fixed on the bundle of letters in his hand. But as he climbed the final step, the morning sun caught his face just right. And I saw it. A tiny silver scar that cut through his left eyebrow, shaped like a lightning bolt. The world stopped. The teacup, a piece of 18th century Meissen porcelain, slipped from my fingers. It shattered on the marble, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the perfect morning quiet. 20 years vanished in an instant. I heard a voice, a ghost from my own throat, whisper the name I had buried long ago. Julian? The mailman finally looked up. His eyes, the same deep brown eyes I had memorized, were cold, empty pools. There was no recognition, no flicker of memory, just a vacant stare. "Mail for Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp I didn't recognize. He placed the letters on the table next to the shattered porcelain. "Have a good day, ma'am," he added, turning and walking away without another glance, his steps rigid and purposeful. He left me there, frozen on my veranda, surrounded by the beautiful ruins of my carefully constructed peace. The woman who sat at the head of the Vance Industries boardroom was not the same woman whose teacup had shattered that morning. That woman, the one with a ghost in her garden, had been locked away in a soundproof vault deep inside my soul. Here, in this kingdom of glass and steel, there was no room for ghosts. There was only strategy, numbers, and the subtle, relentless pressure of 1,000 livelihoods and billions in market capitalization resting on my shoulders. I had not chosen this throne. It had been thrust upon me by tragedy and abandonment, but in 20 years I had learned not just to occupy it, but to command from it. That afternoon, I was presiding over the quarterly review. It was a ritual, a carefully orchestrated piece of theater where my vice presidents would present their victories and conceal their failures. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken ambition. 7 vice presidents, 7 sharks in tailored suits, sat around the 30-foot mahogany table. They were brilliant, ruthless, and loyal, as long as I remained stronger than they were. But today, they were sharks that smelled blood in the water. The news of a competitor's aggressive new move had reached them, and they were looking for a moment of weakness, a crack in my carefully maintained armor. Robert Sterling, our head of acquisitions, a man with a jaw so tight it looked like he chewed on rocks for breakfast, stood to present his report. His slideshow was a masterpiece of corporate pessimism, full of red arrows and downward trending graphs. The opposition, Titan Global, has made an offer for Viridian Systems that is 20% above our initial bid, he stated, his voice flat and final. They know we want Viridian's patent portfolio. They're trying to force us into a bidding war, bleed us dry on a secondary asset. My recommendation, Madam Chairwoman, is to pull out. We cut our losses and refocus our capital on the European expansion. A murmur of cautious agreement went around the table. It was the safe move, the logical move from the MBA textbooks. It was the move my husband, Julian, a man who loved a good fight but hated a losing one, would have probably made after a moment's thought. But I wasn't Julian. Julian built this company on charisma and bold gambles. I had saved it with ice-cold logic and a willingness to play a longer, quieter game. I let the silence hang in the air for a full 10 seconds, an old tactic of mine. It made people uncomfortable. It made them reevaluate their own certainty. I met the gaze of each person at that table, from young, ambitious Peterson in marketing to the veteran, steady hand of Maria in operations. My eyes, I had been told, were my greatest weapon. They didn't shout. They assessed. They weighed. They judged. Finally, I turned back to Sterling. "Your recommendation is noted, Robert," I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "However, your entire strategy is operating under a flawed premise. You believe Titan Global wants to buy Viridian Systems. You're wrong." I paused, letting that sink in. "They don't want the company. They want to prevent us from having the company. There's a critical difference." I gestured to the screen. "Leave that slide up, Robert. The one showing Viridian's core patent, the data compression algorithm. Titan's own R&D department suffered a catastrophic failure 3 months ago, trying to develop something similar. We know this from our internal intelligence. They are not bidding for an asset. They are bidding to block their greatest competitor, us, from acquiring a technology that would make their entire data division obsolete within a year. This isn't an acquisition, it's an act of desperation." Sterling blinked. The other VPs shifted in their seats, their expressions changing from cautious agreement to intense focus. "I spoke with Dr. Aris from our lead engineering team this morning," I continued, my voice calm, methodical. "He confirms that with Viridian's foundational code, we can develop a superior, next-generation version of that patent within 6 months. 6 months, gentlemen." I let the timeline land like a hammer blow. "So," I concluded, rising slowly from my chair to command the room's full attention, "we are not going to pull out. We are going to counteroffer, but only by a fraction 1%. A nuisance bid. We will file regulatory inquiries. We will leak rumors to the financial press about potential antitrust violations. We will drag this process out for months, forcing them to spend millions in legal and advisory fees. We will bleed them dry, all while our team is quietly making their prized asset worthless. In 6 months, Titan Global will be begging us to take Viridian's entire failing division off their hands at a fraction of today's cost. We are not buying a company, gentlemen. We are buying time, and we are dismantling an enemy from the inside out." The room was dead silent. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Sterling stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, a newfound respect dawning in his eyes. He slowly sat down. "Yes, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice now deferential. "A brilliant strategy." I gave a curt nod. "See that it's done." That was how I survived. That was how I thrived. By seeing 10 moves ahead, by turning every threat into an opportunity. By being the one person in the room who had read not just the reports, but the motives behind them. But the strength I projected in that room was a performance, a carefully constructed fortress. When my driver, Arthur, took me home that evening in the silent, leather-clad cocoon of the Rolls-Royce, the walls of that fortress began to crumble. As the city lights streaked past the tinted windows, the image of the mailman of Julian forced its way back into my mind, his cold eyes, the scar, the gravelly, unfamiliar voice. Was I going mad? Was 20 years of unresolved grief finally manifesting as a waking nightmare? Serafina, my daughter, had all but confirmed it when I had called her earlier, my voice still trembling after the incident. "A therapist, mother," she had said, her tone a frustrating mix of clinical concern and youthful condescension. "Grief can do strange things to the mind. You're under an immense amount of stress." She didn't believe me. To her, her father was a portrait on the wall, a myth, a legend, not a tired man in a mailman's uniform. My home, my magnificent penthouse overlooking the entire city, was no longer a sanctuary. It was a gilded cage, and I was rattling its bars. I walked through the cavernous marble hallways, the echoes of my own footsteps, the only company. I stood before the life-sized oil portrait of Julian that hung in the Grand Library, painted a year before he disappeared. The man in the painting was smiling, charismatic, his eyes full of fire and limitless ambition. He was a king in his prime. I looked at that painting, the perfect preserved image of the man I had loved. Then I thought of the tired, hollowed-out man on my porch, the man with the dead eyes and the cheap blue uniform. And the question that had been screaming in the silent vault of my mind all day finally broke free. "What in God's name happened to you, Julian?" I whispered to the silent, smiling ghost on the wall. The silence, as always, was his only reply. But for the first time in 20 years, I felt that the silence was not an absence. It was a lie, and it was a lie I was going to unravel, one thread at a time. 20 years, it feels like a lifetime, another woman's lifetime. The woman who lived in that memory wasn't a CEO. She was a wife and a mother. Her world wasn't made of glass and steel. It was made of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and the smell of Julian's coffee brewing in the morning. That woman, she was happy. She was blissfully, foolishly happy. The day he disappeared started like any other Tuesday. It was a crisp autumn morning. The sun streamed through the large bay windows of our colonial-style house in the suburbs, the kind of house with a big yard and a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree. Our daughter, Serafina, who was only 8 at the time, was sitting at the kitchen table, meticulously arranging her Cheerios into a perfect circle around the edge of her bowl. She had her father's focus even then. Julian was standing at the counter, already dressed in one of his impeccably tailored suits, a stark contrast to the playful dinosaur tie Serafina had insisted he wear. He was on the phone, one of those bulky early cell phones, pacing back and forth, but he wasn't talking business. He was laughing. Julian was always laughing. His laughter was a deep, rumbling sound that could make the whole house feel safe. He was arranging a surprise weekend trip to Disney World for Serafina, and he winked at me over the top of her head as he confirmed the booking. "Yes, the Grand Floridian," he said into the phone. "Only the best for my 2 favorite girls." He hung up and scooped a protesting Serafina out of her chair, spinning her around. "Guess who's going to meet Mickey Mouse, little mouse?" he roared, his voice booming with joy. Serafina shrieked with delight, her Cheerios forgotten. I stood there by the stove, flipping pancakes, and my heart felt so full I thought it might spill over. This was my life. This perfect, noisy, beautiful life. I thought it would last forever. How naive I was. He put Serafina down and came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his familiar scent of sandalwood and ambition filling my senses. "And what about my biggest girl?" he whispered in my ear. "What adventure can I take you on?" I leaned back into him, smiling. "Just being here with you is adventure enough, Julian." He kissed the side of my neck. "Don't get soft on me now, Ellie," he teased. "We're just getting started. This Vance Industries thing, it's going to be a dynasty. I can feel it. A legacy for Serafina, for our grandchildren." He had such boundless, infectious optimism. He truly believed he could conquer the world, and when I was with him, I believed it too. The morning routine was a comfortable dance we had perfected over the years. I packed Serafina's lunch while he made sure her backpack had all her homework. He checked the tire pressure on my car while I made sure his tie was straight. We moved around each other in perfect, unspoken sync, a team. Before he left, he stood at the front door, his briefcase in hand. He looked like a king about to survey his kingdom. He knelt down to look Serafina in the eye. "You be good for your mama, you hear? I'll see you tonight, little mouse." He hugged her tight. Then he stood up and turned to me. He held my face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking my cheeks. "I love you, Eleanor Vance," he said, his eyes serious for a moment. "Don't you ever forget that." "I love you too, Julian," I said. "Drive safe." He gave me one last lingering kiss. It was warm and familiar and tasted faintly of coffee and promises. And then he walked out the door, down the stone path, and got into his black Mercedes. I stood at the door with Serafina, waving, until the car disappeared around the corner at the end of our street, the last time I ever saw him. The day unfolded with its usual rhythm. I dropped Serafina at school, went to the grocery store, attended a PTA meeting. I remember every mundane detail with a painful clarity. I remember the cashier at the store complimented my purse. I remember arguing with Mrs. Gable at the meeting about the theme for the school bake sale. It was all so normal. There were no warning signs, no crack in the sky, no premonition of the abyss that was about to open up beneath my feet. Evening came. I made his favorite dinner pot roast with roasted potatoes. 7 o'clock came and went. That was unusual. Julian was never late without calling. 8 o'clock. I started to feel a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. I told a worried Serafina that Daddy was just stuck in a late meeting and tucked her into bed. By 9 o'clock, I was pacing the floor. I called his cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. Again and again. I called his secretary Helen at her home. She was frantic. "He never showed up for his 2 o'clock meeting, Eleanor. I've been trying to reach him all afternoon. I thought he was with you." That's when the anxiety turned into pure, cold terror. I called the police. The officer who answered was calm, professional, but dismissive. "Ma'am, you have to wait 24 hours to file a missing persons report." He's a grown man. He probably just had a long day and went for a drink with friends. A drink with friends? Not Julian. Never. He always came home. He always called. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the dark, staring at the front door, willing it to open, willing him to walk in, laughing, with some perfectly reasonable explanation. But the door never opened. The house remained silent, and somewhere in the deepest part of my soul, I knew he was gone. The symphony of my life had stopped, and all that was left was a deafening, terrifying silence. The next morning, the police called. They had found his car. It was parked in a long-term lot at the city airport. His briefcase was on the passenger seat. His cell phone was inside. But Julian was gone. He had vanished, as if he had simply evaporated into thin air. The police investigation was a whirlwind of hollow procedure and quiet futility. Detectives with tired eyes and cheap suits came to the house. They asked the same questions over and over. Was he having an affair? Did he have any enemies? Was he in debt? They looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion, as if I were either a grieving widow or a calculating liar. Every no I gave felt weaker, more desperate. How could I explain a man like Julian, a man who seemed to be loved by everyone, who had no apparent vices, who had simply ceased to exist? Quote, "They searched his office at Vance Industries. They spoke to his partners, his friends, his golf buddies. The story was always the same. Julian was a genius, a force of nature, on top of the world. No one saw it coming. The official police theory settled on the most mundane, and therefore most insulting possibility. He had simply walked away. That my husband, the man who called his 8-year-old daughter Little Mouse and planned surprise trips to Disney World, had willingly abandoned his life for another. But the police investigation was a gentle rain compared to the hurricane of the media. The disappearance of Julian Vance, the charismatic, self-made millionaire, was not just a local news story, it was a national obsession. Our quiet, tree-lined street was transformed into a permanent encampment for news vans. Their satellite dishes rose above the rooftops like metallic vultures, waiting to pick over the carcass of my life. I couldn't leave my own home. To get the mail was to run a gauntlet of flashing camera bulbs and shouted questions. "Mrs. Vance, is it true he had a secret gambling addiction? Eleanor, were you aware of his affair with a Swiss banker? Did you have a fight that morning?" They were relentless parasites feeding on my grief. I had to board up the bay windows where the sun used to stream in, turning my once bright home into a dark, suffocating bunker. Serafina couldn't go to school. The other children, repeating the poison they heard from their parents and the television, whispered that her daddy was a criminal or that her mommy had hurt him. I had to hire a private tutor, further isolating her, trapping her in the same house of whispers that was imprisoning me. I would find her sitting in her room, staring at a photo of her father, her small face a mask of confusion and pain. How do you explain the unexplainable to a child? How do you tell her that the hero of her world might have been a villain all along? The gossip columns and tabloid papers were the cruelest. They painted me as either a pathetic, clueless victim or a cold, calculating black widow. They ran pictures of me from charity galas, smiling next to Julian, and juxtaposed them with blurry, long-lens shots of me now, looking haggard and sleepless, with captions like, "The mask slips," or "What is Eleanor Vance hiding?" My grief was not my own. It was public entertainment. My friends in the high society circles we moved in were no better. There were two types. The first were the grief tourists, women who would come over with casseroles I never ate, their eyes darting around my home, hungry for details they could later share at their country club lunches. They would hug me, their touch as cold as their diamonds, and whisper empty platitudes. "You're so strong, darling. I don't know how you do it." The second type simply vanished, as if my tragedy were a contagious disease they were afraid of catching. The dinner invitations stopped, the friendly phone calls ceased. In the cold, brutal calculus of high society, I was no longer an asset. I was a liability, a scandal. But the greatest threat came from within the walls of Vance Industries itself. The board of directors, men Julian had considered his partners, his brothers in arms, saw his absence as an opportunity. They called an emergency meeting. I was not invited, but my lawyer at the time insisted I attend. I walked into that boardroom, the only woman in a sea of gray suits, and felt their predatory gazes on me. They didn't see a grieving wife. They saw a roadblock. Marcus Thorne, Julian's second in command, a man whose children we had vacationed with, was the one who delivered the blow. "Eleanor," he said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "With Julian gone, the company is vulnerable. The investors are panicked. We need a steady hand. We need to project strength. The board has voted to begin the process of liquidating Julian's majority shares to a holding company. He was trying to steal my husband's legacy from me, right in front of my face." Something inside me snapped. The fog of grief was burned away by a sudden white-hot rage. I stood up, my hands flat on the polished table. "No," I said, my voice shaking but clear. "You will do no such thing. Julian's shares are now my shares. This company is my daughter's birthright. And none of you vultures are going to touch it." I looked at Marcus, the man who was trying to betray his best friend's memory. "If you try to push me out," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "I will not just fight you in this boardroom. I will fight you in the press. I will tell them everything I know about your backroom deals, your offshore accounts, your conveniently forgotten consulting fees. I will burn this company to the ground before I let you have it." The silence in the room was absolute. They had expected a weeping widow. They got a cornered lioness. That day, I stopped being Julian Vance's wife. I became his successor. The battle for my husband's company was the first of many. It was a brutal, ugly war, fought not with weapons, but with proxies and lawsuits and public relations. But in the end, I won. I held on to the throne, but the cost was immense. The soft, happy woman who loved making pancakes was gone forever. In her place was a queen, forged in the fires of betrayal and grief, ruling over a lonely, silent kingdom. Once the immediate wars were won, the media silenced by court orders, the boardroom coup thwarted, a new, longer battle began, the raising of my daughter, Serafina. I looked at her, my sweet, sensitive 8-year-old girl, and I saw not just the last piece of Julian I had left, but the future of the Vance dynasty. The world had shown me its teeth. It was my duty, as her mother and now her queen, to make sure she grew fangs of her own. The bedtime stories about fairy tales and brave knights were replaced. I began reading her articles from the Wall Street Journal. I would simplify the language, of course, turning hostile takeovers into stories of big fish eating little fish and market fluctuations into the changing tides of a great ocean. I wanted the language of power to be her mother tongue. While other girls her age were having tea parties with their dolls, Serafina was learning the difference between assets and liabilities at our dinner table. Her childhood was not a normal one. It couldn't be. Our home, the beautiful colonial house, became a fortress. I hired a full-time security detail. Arthur, my driver, was a former Secret Service agent. Our cook was vetted by the best security firm in the country. Serafina was never allowed to walk to a friend's house alone. Every playdate was a carefully orchestrated security operation. I was terrified of losing her the same way I had lost Julian. In trying to protect her, I built a gilded cage around her childhood. As she grew into a teenager, our relationship became more complex. She was a brilliant student, sharp and perceptive like her father, but she possessed a deep-seated anger that I didn't know how to soothe. An anger directed at the ghost of her father for leaving, and, I suspect, at me for the rigid, controlled world I had built for her. We didn't have the soft, easy relationship I saw between her friends and their mothers. Our conversations were more like strategy sessions. I was her commander-in-chief, not just her mom. I remember one afternoon when she was 16. She came home from her elite private school, her face a thundercloud. "Charlotte's mother is taking her to Paris for a shopping trip for her birthday," she announced, throwing her expensive backpack onto a marble countertop. She just decided to go. Spontaneously. The accusation in her voice was clear. "Spontaneity is a luxury for those with nothing to lose, Serafina," I told her, not looking up from the quarterly report I was reading. "Your birthday trip will be to the shareholders' meeting in Zurich. It's time you saw how the empire is run." I saw the flash of hurt and rebellion in her eyes. "I don't want an empire," she yelled. "I just want a mother." The words struck me harder than any boardroom betrayal, but I couldn't show it. I couldn't afford to be weak, not even for her. "You will thank me one day," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "The world doesn't reward emotion. It rewards strength." She stormed off to her room, and I was left alone in the cavernous kitchen, the silence ringing with the truth of her words. In forging an heiress, was I losing my daughter? I pushed her hard. I made her intern at every division of Vance Industries during her summers. She worked in the mailroom, in accounting, in marketing. I wanted her to understand the company from the ground up. I scrutinized her friendships, her romantic interests. Was he from a good family? What were his ambitions? Was he a potential asset or a future liability? Love, in our world, was a merger, and I was the chief regulator. My greatest failure, I see now, was how I spoke of her father. To protect her from the painful uncertainty, I curated his memory. I sealed it in amber. In my stories, Julian became a myth, a flawless legend of business acumen and fatherly love. I never told her about the police suspicions, the whispers of gambling debts, or the possibility that he had simply chosen to leave. I gave her a perfect, martyred saint to worship, a man no living person could ever compete with. The consequence of this was something I never anticipated. In her mind, her father's disappearance became a closed case, a tragedy, but a finished chapter. When she would find me late at night in the library, staring at his portrait, she didn't see a woman wrestling with a 20-year-old mystery. She saw a woman trapped in the past, unable to move on. Her advice, like the suggestion of a therapist, wasn't born from a lack of love, but from a fundamental misunderstanding of the truth. She thought I was grieving a death. She had no idea I was living in a cold case. So when I called her that morning, my voice trembling, telling her that I had seen her father, a man in a mailman's uniform, her reaction was not one of shock, but of weary concern. "Maman," she said, slipping into the French she learned at her Swiss boarding school, a language that always created a subtle distance between us. "You've been under immense stress. The anniversary is coming up. The mind plays tricks. Let's not do this to ourselves again." She was trying to protect me, to protect the neat, orderly narrative of our lives. She was trying to be the strong one, using the very lessons of emotional detachment I had taught her. I had forged her into a queen, a successor. I had taught her to see the world in black and white, in assets and liabilities. And in doing so, I had inadvertently taught her to see her own mother's reality as an emotional, unreliable variable. I had armed her so well for the world that I had left her with no defenses against the impossible. I was utterly, completely alone in this, and it was a loneliness of my own making. After Serafina's dismissive phone call, a cold, hard clarity settled over me. My daughter, the heiress I had so carefully forged, would be no help. My friends, the few that remained, would offer only pitying glances and whispers behind my back. The police had closed their case 15 years ago. I was alone in this, and a part of me, the part that had fought off boardroom vultures and media jackals, was relieved. This was a battle I would have to fight on my own terms, with my own methods. The shock of that first morning had subsided, replaced by the familiar hum of strategic thinking. If this man was Julian, he was not here by accident. His appearance as a common mailman at the gates of his own former kingdom was either a desperate cry for help, a calculated threat, or a message. My first task was to determine which. From that day on, my morning ritual changed. Instead of the Financial Times, I took my tea on the veranda with a direct, high-definition feed from the estate's security system on a tablet beside me. Vance Industries had equipped my home with a surveillance network that would be the envy of a small government. Every angle was covered, every sound was recorded. For 20 years it had been a system to keep the world out. Now it was a system to watch one man. His name, according to the temporary ID clipped to his uniform shirt, was Mark Johnson. He was meticulous, professional. He arrived at precisely 10:17 a.m. every morning. He never lingered, he never spoke unless spoken to. To any casual observer, he was just another civil servant on his route. But I wasn't a casual observer. I was a CEO, trained to spot anomalies in patterns, to find the signal in the noise. And there were signals, tiny, almost imperceptible tells. On Tuesday, he dropped a catalog for a hardware store. As he bent to pick it up, his eyes darted towards the old oak tree in the front yard, the one that still bore the faint scars from the tire swing. Julian had hung for Serafina. It was a glance that lasted no more than a second, but it was filled with something that looked like memory. On Wednesday, I decided to run my first test, a subtle probe. Before he arrived, I went outside and placed a small, ornate silver box on the wicker table on the veranda, right next to where he would place the mail. It was our old anniversary box. Inside, Julian used to keep the ticket stubs from our first date. It meant nothing to a stranger, but to him, it would mean everything. I watched on the tablet from my library. He approached, placed the mail down, and his eyes fell on the box. His professional mask didn't slip, but his hand, the one holding his mailbag, tightened for just a fraction of a second. He knew. He knew what it was. The next day, I escalated the test. I instructed my head gardener, Miguel, a man who had been with us for 30 years and still mourned the master of the house, to replant the flower beds along the main driveway. Not with the usual bright, cheerful petunias, but with black baccara roses, a rare, deep crimson rose that looked almost black. They had been Julian's obsession. A dramatic, almost gothic flower, he said, reminded him of passionate secrets. Miguel looked at me, a question in his old wise eyes, but he simply nodded. "As you wish, Mrs. Vance." When Mark drove his mail truck up the driveway the following morning, he slowed down, his head turned towards the new, dark blooms. The security cameras caught it clearly. He stopped the truck for a full 10 seconds, just staring, lost in a world only he could see. It was the first real crack I had seen in his emotionless facade. But these signals, these flickers of recognition, were not enough. They were circumstantial, things my daughter would dismiss as coincidence, as the projections of a grieving mind. I needed something concrete, something undeniable. And for that, I had to take a greater risk. I decided to confront him again, but not as a shocked wife, as a stranger making conversation. That afternoon, I waited for him near the gates as he was finishing his delivery. I was holding a small basket of vegetables from my garden. "Good afternoon," I said, my voice friendly and casual. He stopped, looking trapped. "Ma'am," he grunted, not meeting my eyes. "I see you admiring my new roses," I continued, forcing a light, airy tone. A bit morbid for my taste, but my late husband adored them. He was a man of intense passions. I watched his face. Nothing. A perfect poker face, but I saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. "You look very familiar, you know," I pressed on gently. "Have we met before? Perhaps at one of my late husband's charity events?" His name was Julian Vance. I said his name, the name of the man he was pretending not to be, and I watched him for any reaction. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were like chips of cold, dark ice. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am," he said, his voice a gravelly monotone. "But I'm new to this state. I wouldn't know anyone from your high society circles. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a schedule to keep." He turned and walked away, his back ramrod straight. The rejection was absolute, the denial unshakable. I stood there, holding my basket of vegetables, feeling a chill despite the warm afternoon Sunday. This was not a man suffering from amnesia. This was not a simple look-alike. This was a performance. A deliberate, calculated, and terrified performance. He wasn't just hiding his identity, he was running from something. And I realized, with a dawning sense of dread, that by trying to unmask him, I might not be uncovering a long-lost love. I might be stepping into the very danger that had made him disappear in the first place. The coldness in his eyes, the finality in his denial, it did not deter me. It solidified my resolve, but it also filled me with a creeping dread. This was no longer a personal mystery to be solved. It was a conspiracy to be unraveled. And I knew, with the chilling certainty of a CEO who has faced down boardroom betrayals, that I could not do it alone. I needed an ally, a confidant. I needed someone to believe me. My first and most logical choice was my daughter, Serafina. Despite the distance that had grown between us, she was Julian's child. She was my flesh and blood. She deserved to know. I invited her to dinner at the estate that evening, a rare occurrence outside of holidays. I had my chef prepare her favorite dish from childhood, coq au vin, a rich, complex stew that took hours to perfect. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that a taste of the past might make her more receptive to its return. She arrived looking like the cover of a business magazine, dressed in a sleek, minimalist pantsuit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She was the perfect image of the heiress I had trained her to be. We sat at the enormous dining table, the two of us separated by an ocean of polished mahogany. I waited until after the main course, until the wine had perhaps softened her pragmatic edges. I recounted everything, my voice calm and measured. I told her about the scar, the tightening of his hand when he saw the anniversary box, the way he paused to look at the black baccara roses. I told her about his cold, rehearsed denial. I laid out the evidence as I would in a boardroom, piece by logical piece. She listened patiently, her fork resting on her plate, a small, sad smile on her lips. It was the smile of a parent listening to a child's fantastical tale. When I finished, she reached across the table and placed her cool, manicured hand on mine. "Maman," she began, using the French term that always felt more like a title than a term of endearment. "I know this is difficult. The anniversary of his disappearance is next month. It's natural for you to be thinking of him more, for your mind to see things." My heart sank. "Serafina, this is not in my mind. This was real. I saw him." "You saw a man who looks like him," she corrected gently, as if explaining a complex financial chart to a novice. "The world is full of doppelgangers, and you are under an immense amount of stress. The Titan global acquisition, the European expansion. You're carrying the weight of an empire. It's taking a toll. Perhaps it's time you considered taking a step back, a sabbatical. Let me handle things for a while." Her words were like a dagger wrapped in the silk of concern. She wasn't just dismissing my reality, she was questioning my competence. She was using the very lessons of strength and control I had taught her against me. The unreliable, emotional variable had reared its head. "So you don't believe me," I stated, not as a question, but as a confirmation. She sighed, withdrawing her hand. "I believe you are grieving," she said, her voice firm. "And I believe you are putting the Vance family name at risk by entertaining these fantasies. Imagine if this got out to the press. Eleanor Vance claims dead husband is a mailman. Our stock would plummet. Mother, for the good of the company, for the good of our family, you must let this go. Let him rest in peace." She was protecting the empire. I had taught her too well. The rest of the dinner was a silent, painful affair. I had sought an ally and found a dissenter. I had looked for a daughter and found a CEO. My second attempt was with Margaret, my oldest and dearest friend. We had known each other since before Julian, since we were two ambitious young women navigating the city. She had held my hand at Julian's memorial service and had been the only one to stand by me during the media storm. If anyone would understand, it would be her. I met her for lunch at our usual spot, a quiet, discreet restaurant favored by the city's old money. This time, I brought proof. I had my head of security print out a high-resolution, time-stamped still from the surveillance footage, a clear shot of Mark's face as he looked at the roses. Margaret listened, her brow furrowed with concern. When I finished, I slid the photograph across the table. "Look, Maggie, look at his eyes." She picked it up, holding it close. She stared at it for a long time. "Oh, Eleanor," she finally breathed, her voice full of pity. "I see the resemblance, I do. It's uncanny, but it's not him. The face is thinner, the lines are harder. This man looks broken." Julian was never broken. She slid the photo back to me. "My dear," she continued, her voice soft, "you have built an incredible life out of the ashes of a tragedy. You are one of the strongest people I know, but you never truly let him go. You never had a body to bury. Maybe this is your mind's way of finally creating one, of giving you a mystery to solve so you don't have to face the empty space he left behind." She reached for my hand. "Don't do this to yourself. Don't chase a ghost." I sat there, looking from my daughter's pragmatic dismissal to my best friend's compassionate pity. They were two sides of the same coin. They both thought I was losing my mind, that I was a fragile widow haunted by the past. They saw a woman in need of protection from herself. They didn't see the truth. They didn't see the strategist who had just identified a threat, the queen who had just discovered a traitor or a prisoner at her own gates. I was utterly and completely alone. The wall of skepticism was impenetrable. And I knew, as I paid the bill and walked out into the bright, indifferent city, that I would never speak of this to anyone again. The investigation from this point forward would be conducted in the shadows. Disbelief can be a prison, but it can also be a liberation. The moment I realized no one would help me was the moment I was freed from the need for their approval. I was no longer a wife trying to find her husband or a mother seeking validation. I was the chairwoman of Vance Industries, and I was initiating a private off-the-books inquiry into a potential security threat. The next morning, I did not call a private investigator from the phone book. I summoned Arthur Hayes to my home office. Arthur was more than my driver. He was the head of my personal security detail, a man I had personally headhunted from MI6 15 years ago. He was a ghost, a man whose official record showed he was a retired accountant living in the suburbs. In reality, he ran the most sophisticated corporate intelligence unit on the East Coast, all under the discreet umbrella of Vance Industries. Arthur entered the library, a tall, impeccably dressed man in his late 50s, with eyes that missed nothing. He stood silently, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting. He did not ask why he was there, he simply waited for his directive. "Arthur," I began, my voice calm, "we have a situation. I need a full, deep background workup on an individual. His name is Mark Johnson. He is currently employed by the United States Postal Service, assigned to the delivery route in my neighborhood." I swiveled the large monitor on my desk to face him. On the screen was the high-resolution still from the security camera, the mailman staring at the roses. Arthur looked at the picture for a long moment. He did not show any surprise, but I saw a flicker of intense focus in his eyes. "Understood, Mrs. Vance," he said. "What is the nature of the inquiry? Threat assessment? Financial vulnerability?" I paused, choosing my words with care. "The nature of the inquiry island. Identity verification. I want to know everything about him. Not the man on the surface, but the man underneath. I want to know where he came from, where he sleeps, who he talks to. I want to know what he ate for breakfast. I want every digital and physical footprint he has left on this earth for the past 20 years. And I want it done with zero trace. This man and the USPS must never know they are being observed. This investigation does not exist." "Consider it done," he said with a slight nod. "I will need access to the full estate security archives from the past 2 weeks." "You have it," I replied. "What is your preliminary timeline?" 24 hours for the initial profile, 48 for a deep dive," he said, his voice as certain as a surgeon predicting the outcome of a routine operation. Then he turned and left as silently as he had entered. While my daughter and my best friend saw a ghost, Arthur Hayes saw a target, and he was the best hunter I knew. For the next 24 hours, I operated on pure adrenaline. I went to the office, chaired my meetings, and made multi-million-dollar decisions with one part of my brain while the other was screaming for Arthur's report. The waiting was a unique form of torture, a high-stakes game where I didn't even know the rules. The call came the next afternoon. "The initial profile is ready, Mrs. Vance," Arthur's voice said, devoid of emotion. "I think you should see this in person." I told him I was on my way home. When I entered the library, Arthur was waiting. He had set up a secure, encrypted laptop on my desk. "We started with the basics," he began, his tone that of a professor giving a lecture. "Mark Johnson. Age, 58 according to his employment records. Social security number traces back to a batch issued in Nevada 15 years ago. No driver's license prior to that. No credit history, no birth certificate on file. For the first 43 years of his life, according to the official record, Mark Johnson did not exist." He paused. "He is a ghost. A professional ghost." My heart hammered in my chest, but I kept my face a mask of calm. "Go on." We cross-referenced his biometrics. His facial structure is a 97.8% match to Julian Vance. Allowing for 20 years of aging and environmental factors, that is a statistical certainty. But that's not the interesting part. He clicked a key, and a new file opened. We obtained his employment application through a contact at the Postal Service. It required a fingerprint scan. We ran that scan against every database we have access to, domestic, international, and a few that aren't officially on any list. He looked up at me. "The fingerprints, Mrs. Vance, were a perfect match. Not for Julian Vance, his prints were never in any system. They were a match for a John Doe, a decorated Special Forces operator who was listed as killed in action during a covert operation in Bosnia 25 years ago." I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. Special Forces? KIA? None of it made sense. Julian was a businessman, a numbers man. He couldn't even handle a horror movie. "It gets stranger," Arthur continued, seemingly reading my thoughts. "We dug deeper into Vance Industries' records from 20 years ago. Specifically, the financials of a major construction subsidiary Julian was personally overseeing. The company was working on several large government infrastructure projects. 6 months before he disappeared, Julian made a direct request to the National Archives for the service records of 3 of his construction foremen. All 3 men were also former Special Forces, and all 3 also died in accidents within a year of Julian's disappearance." Arthur leaned in, his voice dropping. "But the final piece of the puzzle came from a source of mine in the intelligence community. I asked him to run a search on a very specific keyword, a rogue deep cover operation from the early 90s. The name of that operation was Project Chimera. He found a connection. Just before he vanished, Julian Vance made multiple inquiries about Project Chimera to a contact he had at the State Department. 2 days after his last inquiry, his contact, a respected investigative journalist, was killed in a car bombing in Beirut." Arthur looked at me, his eyes grave. "Mrs. Vance, whatever your husband discovered, it wasn't a simple case of corporate fraud. He stumbled into a hornet's nest of the highest order. This wasn't a man who ran away from his family. This was a man who was running for his life. The library, once my sanctuary, now felt like a war room." Arthur's words hung in the air, heavy and cold as lead. Special Forces, Project Chimera, a car bombing in Beirut. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered across my desk, but they were forming a picture far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. My husband, the man I thought I knew, was a stranger entangled in a web of shadows and violence. I looked at Arthur, his face impassive. "This journalist," I said, my voice sharp and focused. "The one in Beirut, what was his name?" "Daniel Peterson," Arthur replied without hesitation, "a Pulitzer Prize winner known for exposing government corruption." The name sparked a memory, a faint echo from 2 decades ago. "Peterson," I murmured, closing my eyes, forcing myself to sift through the archives of my mind. He called the house. A few days before Julian disappeared, Julian took the call in his study. He was in there for hours. When he came out, his face was pale. He told me it was just a source for a story about a competitor. He told me not to worry. Another lie. A lie meant to protect me. My mind was racing, connecting the disparate threads. Julian, the brilliant numbers man, must have seen something in the construction subsidiary's books, a pattern, an anomaly that pointed to something far worse than simple fraud. He starts digging. He discovers his own foremen are not who they seem. He reaches out to a trusted journalist, and in doing so, he signs both of their death warrants. But the journalist dies, and Julian, Julian vanishes. He was too smart to be caught. He knew they were coming for him. He orchestrated his own disappearance to save his life, and to save ours. He had been in hiding for 20 years. A ghost. A man erased from the world. But now he was back. Why now? The question burned in my mind. A man who goes to such extreme lengths to disappear doesn't just reappear on a whim. His return was not a coincidence. It was a calculated move. He was either running from a new threat, or he had returned to face an old one. And his job as a mailman? It wasn't a random disguise. It was a surveillance post. It gave him the perfect cover to watch the estate, to watch me, to protect me from a danger I didn't even know existed. I looked at Arthur. The network he uncovered, I said, my thoughts crystallizing into a hypothesis. The people behind Project Chimera, are they still active? Arthur's expression was grim. Our intelligence suggests the original players have mostly retired or died, but power structures like that don't just disappear, they evolve. They pass down to the next generation. The son of the man who ran the construction subsidiary, a man named Marcus Thorne Jr., is now a major political lobbyist in Washington, D.C. He's powerful, connected, and known for being far more ruthless than his father ever was. Marcus Thorne. The name was familiar. I had seen him on the news, a smiling, charismatic man shaking hands with senators. He was one of the key lobbyists pushing for the deregulation bill that Vance Industries was currently fighting against. It wasn't just a ghost from the past. The enemy was right in front of me, in the present day, an opponent in my own corporate battles. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Julian had come back because the fight had come back to me. Thorne Jr. must have seen Vance Industries as a threat. He must have started digging into our history, into Julian's history, and in doing so, he had likely reawakened the dormant conspiracy. Julian's return was a warning. He was a silent sentinel, standing guard at my gate. I felt a surge of adrenaline, the same feeling I got before a hostile takeover bid. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, protective determination. For 20 years, I had defended Julian's legacy. Now, I had to defend his life. I couldn't confront Julian directly. If he was under surveillance, any contact could expose him. It could get us both killed. I had to send him a message, a signal that I understood, that I was no longer a pawn to be protected, but a player in the game, a queen. I needed to respond in a language of power that both he and our enemies would understand. My eyes fell upon the invitation sitting on my desk. The annual Vance Foundation Charity Gala was in 2 weeks. It was the premier high society event of the year, attended by senators, CEOs, and journalists. It was also an event that Marcus Thorne Jr. was scheduled to attend. I looked at Arthur, a plan forming with cold, swift precision. "Arthur," I said, my voice steady, "cancel the keynote speaker for the gala. I will be giving the address myself." Arthur raised an eyebrow, the closest he ever came to showing surprise. "And what will be the topic of your address, Mrs. Vance?" "I am going to announce the formation of a new, multi-billion-dollar initiative," I replied, a dangerous smile touching my lips for the first time that day. "The Julian Vance Endowment for Journalistic Integrity. Its sole purpose will be to fund investigative journalists who specialize in uncovering corporate and political corruption. The first grant recipient will be the Daniel Peterson Memorial Fund." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city. My city. "I am going to turn a spotlight on the very shadows they've been hiding in for 20 years, I said. "Let's see who scurries when the lights come on." It was a declaration of war, broadcast to the entire world, a message to our enemies that we were no longer afraid. And a message to my husband, wherever he was hiding, that the Queen was ready to move her pieces onto the board. The 2 weeks leading up to the Vance Foundation Gala were the most intensely focused of my life. On the surface, I was simply Eleanor Vance, the meticulous chairwoman, overseeing every detail of her flagship charity event. I approved flower arrangements, finalized the guest list, and tasted catering samples with a serene smile. But behind the scenes, Arthur and his team were engaged in a silent, invisible war. They swept my home and office for listening devices, fortified my digital security, and began a quiet, deep dive investigation into every aspect of Marcus Thorne Jr.'s life and business dealings. I was moving through my life as if in a play, every word and action a calculated performance for an unseen audience. My public relations team was frantic. A last-minute change to the keynote, announcing a multi-billion-dollar fund without consulting the board. "Eleanor, this is unprecedented." They'd protest. I would just look at them with a calm that unnerved them and say, "Trust me, this will be the most memorable gala in our foundation's history." They had no idea how true that was. The night of the gala arrived. The grand ballroom of the Carlisle Hotel was a glittering sea of diamonds, tuxedos, and power. Senators laughed with tech billionaires, artists chatted with investment bankers. It was my world, a world of elegant surfaces and brutal undercurrents. I moved through the crowd, a queen in my element, dressed in a gown of deep sapphire silk that shimmered under the chandeliers. I smiled. I shook hands, I made small talk, all the while my internal sensors were on high alert, scanning the room, searching. And then I saw him, Marcus Thorne Jr. He was standing near the bar, holding court, exuding the same effortless, predatory charm that his father had. He caught my eye across the room and gave me a brilliant, toothy smile, a wolf's smile. It was a greeting, but it was also a challenge. The game had begun. Later that evening, it was time. I walked onto the stage, the cavernous ballroom falling silent. 1,000 pairs of eyes were on me. The warmth of the spotlights felt like an interrogation lamp. I saw Serafina in the front row, her expression a mixture of pride and confusion. I saw Marcus Thorne Jr., his smile still in place, but his eyes were watchful, alert. And somewhere out there, I prayed, Julian would see or hear this. I began my speech, starting with the usual pleasantries, thanking our generous donors. Then, I changed course. "For 20 years, I began, my voice clear and strong, echoing through the silent hall. The Vance Foundation has focused on the arts, on education, on building a better future. But tonight, we must also look at the past. We must honor the legacy of our founder, my late husband, Julian Vance." I paused, letting his name hang in the air. "Julian was a man who believed in the truth," I continued, my eyes finding Marcus Thorne Jr. in the crowd. "He believed that corruption, whether in corporate boardrooms or the halls of government, is a cancer that preys on the silent. He believed that the brightest light to disinfect the shadows is the fearless work of investigative journalism." I saw Thorne's smile falter. Just for a second. His eyes narrowed. "That is why, tonight, I am proud to announce the formation of a new, multi-billion-dollar initiative, the Julian Vance Endowment for Journalistic Integrity." A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the audience. "This endowment will provide grants, legal support, and protection to journalists around the world who are brave enough to uncover the truth, no matter how powerful the forces they oppose." I took a breath, preparing for the final blow. "And I am honored to announce that the endowment's very first grant, a grant of $50 million, will be awarded to the Daniel Peterson Memorial Fund, to continue his life's work of exposing criminal conspiracies that reach the highest levels of power." The name Daniel Peterson landed like a bomb in the silent room. I saw Marcus Thorne Jr.'s face go white. The wolf's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, cold fury. He knew exactly what I was doing. It was not a charity announcement. It was a public declaration of war. I had just told him, in front of the most powerful people in the country, "I know who you are, and I am coming for you." The rest of the night was a blur. I was inundated with questions, with praise, with confused looks. I navigated it all with a calm smile, but my mind was elsewhere. The message had been sent. Now, I had to wait for the response. It came sooner than I expected. When Arthur drove me back to the estate, he pointed out a dark sedan parked half a block down the street from my gates. It had no license plates. "They're here," he said, his voice grim. "They've taken the bait." We entered the estate through a secondary secured entrance. That night, I did not go to bed. I sat in my library, the same room where Julian's smiling portrait mocked me from the wall. I dismissed my security detail to the perimeter of the estate, a calculated risk. I knew he wouldn't come if there were guards at the door. I sat in the dark, with only a single lamp casting a warm glow on the leather armchair opposite me, and I waited. Around 2 a.m., it happened. Not a sound, not a whisper, just a change in the quality of the silence, a flicker of movement in the shadows near the French doors. I didn't flinch. "I was wondering when you'd show up," I said to the empty room. A figure detached itself from the darkness. He was dressed in black, his face gaunt and tired, but his movements were fluid, silent as a cat. He stepped into the lamplight. It was him. The mailman. My husband. "Eleanor," Julian breathed, his voice a hoarse, urgent whisper, the gravelly rasp I heard on the porch now filled with 20 years of pain and fear. "What have you done? You just put a target on your own back. You put a target on both of us." He looked older, more broken than he had in the daylight. The weight of his 2 decades in the shadows was etched into every line on his face. "They're watching the house right now. Thorne's people. They followed you from the gala. Your speech. Ellie, that wasn't a warning shot. That was a suicide mission." "Was it?" I replied, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Or was it a queen calling her long-lost king back to the board?" I stood up and faced him, the man who was both my greatest love and my greatest mystery. "I couldn't just stand by and let you fight this alone, Julian. Not anymore. You've been a ghost for 20 years. It's time you came back to life." He stared at me, his cold, empty eyes now filled with a storm of emotions, anger, fear, and something else. Something that looked like a flicker of the old love I remembered. "They will come for you, Eleanor," he warned, his voice low and intense. "I know," I said, walking towards the heavy mahogany desk. "But this time, we will be ready for them." I pressed a hidden button on the side of the desk. A section of the bookshelf behind me slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing a steel door with a biometric scanner. "You see, Julian," I said, turning back to face his stunned expression, "you weren't the only one who learned how to keep secrets." "Of course, it's time to bring our high-stakes game to its conclusion. This final part will resolve the immediate threat and then address the more complex, emotional fallout of Julian's return. The goal is a conclusion that feels both satisfyingly triumphant and emotionally realistic, leaving the audience with a powerful, thought-provoking message. The look on Julian's face was something I would never forget. It was a mixture of awe, disbelief, and for the first time since he had reappeared in my life, a glimmer of the man I had married, the man who loved a bold, audacious plan. In that secret, steel-lined room, surrounded by secure communication arrays and files Arthur had compiled, we stopped being a ghost and a queen. We became partners again. The endgame was swift and brutal. We didn't wait for them to make a move. We struck first. Julian, using the evidence he had painstakingly gathered over 20 years, became the ultimate anonymous source. Arthur's intelligence team packaged the information, financial records, witness testimonies, encrypted communications, and delivered it not to the authorities, who Julian knew were compromised, but simultaneously to the top investigative journalists at the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. My journalistic integrity fund was not just a threat, it was the delivery system for the bomb. The story broke on a Monday morning. It was a political and corporate earthquake. Project Chimera, the decades-old conspiracy, was laid bare for the world to see. The scandal was immense, implicating Marcus Thorne Jr. and a half-dozen high-ranking officials. The public outcry was deafening. By noon, federal indictments were being unsealed. By evening, Marcus Thorne Jr. was in custody, his smiling, charismatic face now a scowling mugshot on every news channel. It was over. The shadows that had haunted our family for 20 years had been vanquished by the brightest of lights, the truth. After the storm passed, a new, more complicated quiet settled between Julian and me. He was no longer a mailman, no longer a ghost. He was exonerated, a hero. But he was also a stranger. We stood in that same grand library, the portrait of the younger, smiling Julian looking down on us, a relic from another lifetime. He had lost 2 decades of his life, of our daughter's life. I had lost the man I loved and had been forced to become someone else entirely to survive. The love was still there, an echo in the quiet moments, but it was buried under layers of pain, secrets, and the vast, unbridgeable chasm of 20 years lived apart. "So what happens now, Julian?" I asked, the question hanging in the air between us. He looked around the magnificent room, at the life I had built without him. "I don't know, Eleanor," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of all that was lost. "I don't know if that man in the painting even exists anymore. I don't know if we exist anymore." He looked at me, his eyes full of a profound sadness. "But maybe we could start by getting to know the people we've become." It wasn't the passionate reunion of a romance novel. It was something far more real and far more difficult. A beginning. Not a continuation of an old story, but the first, tentative page of a new one, written by two survivors. They say you can't go home again, but what do you do when home, the very person you built your world around, comes back to you after being a ghost for 20 years? Do you try to rebuild the old house on the same foundation, knowing it's cracked and weathered by time? Or do you have the courage to build something entirely new, right beside the ruins? I still don't have the answer, but for the first time in a very long time, I am hopeful. What would you have done? Let me know in the comments below. Every story I find has a lesson to teach.